So today I will be talking about medieval Wales as it relates to my After Cilmeri series, which is what the raffle is for. I hope that's what you came to hear. We did try to say medieval Wales, what we're talking about. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have at the end, whether about Wales or the books, or I know some of you have asked my writing process or how I've got started and all of that, and I'm happy to answer any of that. So I'm going to begin today by setting the stage for the fall of Wales to England. It begins actually with a Welsh victory at the Llysoedd Sands in North Wales. So by November of 1282, the war had been going on for about 7 months. It had been started because David, who was the younger brother to the last Prince of Wales, you might know as Llywelyn the Last as well, had decided that the deal that he made with King Edward wasn't as good as he thought. I don't know how many of you watched Empire Strikes Back, but when Darth Vader makes a deal with you, it doesn't always work out. And that was definitely the case with David. So he had rebelled in March of 1282. The war actually had been going well for the Welsh, mostly victories this whole time. So King Edward had hoped to, in November, as winter was coming on, to catch Llywelyn, who was here at Aber, in a pincer movement. He was at Rhuddlan Castle, and he was going to move an army to Caernarfon to cross the Conwy River, to force the river at a ford. There was no bridges, just a ford. And he sent a Norman named Tanny to Anglesey to take it. Anglesey was the breadbasket of Wales. He did, in fact, take it and captured the harvest. So Llywelyn, who was here at Aber, was, in a sense, reduced and cornered. And then the Archbishop of Canterbury steps in, and he's trying to avoid more bloodshed. The Archbishop may have even been at Aber the day that Tanny crossed the Menai Strait. Now, he had done that with a bridge of boats. These are the Llysoedd Sands. So I don't know if you can see. So this is sand. This is all sand. This is a channel. This is Anglesey over here. So that's Gwynedd over there and Anglesey over here. And this is a dredged channel, only dredged in modern times. So twice a day, in medieval times, you could actually walk across the Menai Strait on the sand. So the English had built a bridge of boats because they were going to bring horses, and the sand is obviously going to give way. It's really saturated. So as the tide is all the way out, Tanny starts across the Menai Strait on this bridge. He gets to the Gwynedd side and discovers that the Welsh knew about it. And they attack from the heights, and they do so well anyway that the English are now literally caught between a Welsh force and a tide that has turned. So they're scrambling back across that bridge of boats to Anglesey, and the bridge breaks, and it dumps them into the water. I have a quote I'm going to read. As reported in the Chronicle of the Kings, the king and his host came to Rhuddlan, and he sent a fleet of ships to Anglesey, and they gained possession of Arfon. And then was made the bridge over the Menai, but the bridge broke, and countless numbers of the English were drowned, and others slain. The English lost Tanny himself, several other noblemen, 16 knights, 400 soldiers, and it was a great victory for the Welsh. Unfortunately, it was also their undoing. And this was because Llywelyn then left his brother in charge of Gwynedd and traveled to Cilmeri, where the English lured him into an ambush and assassinated him. This is a monument that was put up in a farmer's field in the vicinity of where Llywelyn died. So this single event is what drew me to writing novels set in medieval Wales in the first place. I think my experience is that there's not It's not often that you find an event that changed everything, where the world between 1 second and the next becomes a very different place. And that is really what the death of the last Prince of Wales, Llywelyn, did for Wales. So in this talk, I'm going to examine this world of medieval Wales, talking about how it was as a way to set the stage for how it could have been. I'll be placing the ambush, and murder of Llywelyn ap Griffith within the context of Welsh history, tracing its origins and consequences, and then asking, what if? What would have happened if Llywelyn had lived, as well as what happens to the American family that saves him, which is what I have written into my After Cilmeri series. So that question is really the central premise of the series, which is now 20 books long. Yeah, this one. That's me a long time ago, 1988. So before we get any further, I thought I'd say a bit about how I got started writing books set in medieval Wales. Often when I visit Wales, people ask how it is that I write these books and why on earth I have learned to speak Welsh. So this is what I say. I don't know, does anyone speak Welsh in this room? I'm going to say something in Welsh just to show off then. Des I Gymru y tro cyntaf yn ystod fy amser yn y prifysgol. Nes I ymweld castell Conwy a syrthio mewn cariad. Wedyn, ddydodd fy dad wrtho fi, ges I deulu oedd yn byw yn Gymru 400 mlynedd yn ôl. So, I'm glad you all understood that. So, that in English is, I visited Wales for the first time while in college. My friends and I went to Conwy Castle, and I fell in love with the people, with the culture. I remember running along the battlement at Conwy. There were no guardrails. I thought that was just really fascinating coming from America. And then my dad told me that we had Welsh ancestry 400 years ago. Actually coming to Arvonia, where the settlement is 1867, is that? 69. So my ancestors came to the Massachusetts colony in the 1600s. Not a lot of them, but Morgans. So it does seem to be a Welsh connection there. As well as, which I see around in this town, John Woodbury, who's my 13 generation back ancestor, and some of you as well, married Joanna Humphrey. So there's that Welsh connection there as well. So the next step for me was not actually writing novels. Instead, I got my PhD in anthropology in 1995. A decade later, the longer story is that I got my PhD, but I had 2 children at the time, and decided that pursuing tenure was not for me. So I spent, really 30 years, because my youngest is now 19, 30 years being a full-time mom and homeschooling my children. And then I started writing for the first time in 2006, really just to see if I could. But so starting in 2006, I pivoted to the history of Wales. As an anthropologist, for me, anthropology is really, history is really the anthropology of the past. The idea is to translate this medieval world for a modern audience in a way that makes sense. So it was 17 years ago that I started my first novel. Yeah, and I put this up. I hope you all love this. Wales for you. So how many times have I said, I write novels set in medieval Wales? And what I get is this cross-eyed, medieval Wales. How does that, it just happened like last week, in fact, and I'm just here's the slide. Yes, I mean the country, not the aquatic mammal. Obviously, for those of you who know Wales or have Welsh ancestry, Wales isn't a place that many Americans know a whole lot about. And again, actually, my job, in addition to the anthropological aspect, is in writing fiction set in medieval Wales, is in some sense educating people about a place that they have never heard about, and that it isn't what they think. It's not the Tudors, it's not Outlander, it's its own thing. As well as, telling a good story. So just so we're all on the same page, Wales is a small country, part of the United Kingdom, where they speak Welsh and English. In the medieval period, it was composed of smaller kingdoms, as shown on this map. So I'm going to go quite far back in time to talk about Llywelyn, because Llywelyn and Edward didn't come into conflict out of the blue. Their animosity was the result of more than just their personal interactions. It's really 1,500 years of history to reach the moment where Wales falls irrevocably to England. And that's in large part because from the very beginning, Wales and Britain as a whole was at a crossroads of competing cultures and invading armies. My lovely husband made this map, or this chart. It gives a good overview of how we're going to talk about the history of Wales. On the top is a timeline showing the waves of immigration/invasion, and roughly when they happened. And then below are rough snapshots of how much of Britain each group controlled. There are characters from each of these groups in my books, and actually my books themselves span the gamut from 410 all the way to 1300. So the first people of Britain actually aren't even on this chart. They're the Neolithic group that inhabited much of mainland Europe, starting around 6,000 years ago, maybe as many as 10. They built massive stone monuments. So Stonehenge is an example from England. Bwlch a Ddeufaen, which is the Path of the Two Stones, is an example from Gwynedd. They're guarding this road. There's this one, and then there's a second. They're 5,000-6,000 years old. They've been standing there all this time. These people had no written language. If there were waves of different people, we don't even know, because we really don't know anything about them other than what they left on the landscape. The first people about whom we know more are the Celts. They brought their language and culture and essentially took over all of Britain starting around 800 AD. That would be the Iron Age. Whoever came before was eliminated or assimilated. So there you have Celts. They got it all, right? They came from Europe. They took Ireland too. All good. This beautiful picture, which my husband took, is of Tre'r Ceiri. The Celts left evidence of themselves all over Britain. Tre'r Ceiri is built on the top of a mountain. You can see the wall. This is a stone wall that surrounds the entire town. There are 150 stone hut circles in that village, built 1,200 feet above the valley floor. So they lived up there, we presume, to protect their people, though we do not know from whom. They were still living there when the Romans arrived, from whom they really did need to protect themselves. The Romans invaded in 43 AD. They conquered all of England and Wales and parts of Scotland. And this map really shows you've got the tribes, Brigantes, Ordovices, and then the Romans are the gold lines as they moved in. The Romans called these native people Britons, Britons. Hence the modern word for the island as a whole, Britain, with an AIN. The Romans wanted to control the land and the resources, but they were not particularly concerned about the daily life of the people themselves as long as they submitted to Rome. This was a military conquest rather than settlement for families. Most Romans who came were on a tour of duty from somewhere other in the empire, and they were generally not even Roman most of the time. As part of their conquest, the Romans eliminated the native British political and military hierarchy. And this is super important because if you think about how the way a country works, if anybody who sticks their head up gets it cut off, and there's no army. You have an entire people with no army because they were all, wiped out by the Romans. Even native Britons who were conscripted or enlisted in the Roman army were sent elsewhere. So the Romans left their mark on the landscape too. This is Hadrian's Wall. They built infrastructure for resource extraction, governance, and to protect themselves. Hadrian's Wall is one wall. The Antonine Wall is another. Forts, towns, and roads. And I think anybody who goes to Britain sees all this stuff all over the landscape. And this is a map. So again, we have Hadrian's Wall is the reddish one. Antonine is the blue. That's actually a turf wall. The Romans tried that, and then they retreated back behind Hadrian's Wall. And then Offa's Dyke, which we'll get to in a second. The Romans controlled Britain for 400 years until they marched away in 410 to protect other parts of the empire. Rome was sacked by the Gauls, think in 410. They really up and left, not entirely without warning, but pretty much walked away. This left the Britons leaderless and undefended, just in time for the Saxons, who came in successive waves. And obviously, it's Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. I don't know if that's something that we learned in school. So I'm saying Saxons. The Welsh called them Sasneg. The Saxons, the Welsh word is Saesneg. To this day, they call the English Saesneg. So they're just Saxons to them. Initially, they were just raiding, but then they brought their families. The Britons, at the time, wrote letters to the Romans, actually many in Constantinople by now, since Rome had fallen, begging for them to return. And protect them from the Saxons, which they did not do. They said, sorry, we're gone, fend for yourselves. This was a cultural clash. Not only they're different peoples, the Saxons and the Britons/Celts, but the Saxons were pagan and the Welsh were the Britons were Christian. Rome converted to Christianity in the 300s. The first Christian martyr in Britain was St. Albans in 127. So really early Christianity here in Britain. So that was a big difference for the Britons, is to say, hey, look, Romans, we're a Christian, can you please come? And they were like, no, sorry. So the Saxons eventually consolidated their hold on all of what is now England. The Britons were forced into the west, into Wales, and they became Welsh, which means foreigner in Saxon. The Welsh word for themselves is Cymri. To keep out Welsh incursions, around 800 the Saxons built Offa's Dyke. It's a 20-foot high, 170-mile turf wall separating England and Wales, and it was on that map that we looked at a little bit ago. Where is it? There it is. So there's Offa's Dyke. It was dug out on the Welsh side and piled higher on the English side so that the Saxons/English could look into Wales. Not long after the building of Offa's Dyke, the Saxons faced raiders from the east. These are called Danes. These are the first of the Viking invaders, with the idea that to be a Viking, it's an occupation, not an ethnic group. You go a Viking. So Swedes could be Vikings, Danes could be Vikings, Norwegians could be Vikings. These were Danes. The Danes conquered lands all along the coasts of Britain, Ireland, France, Sicily, and all the way to Russia. The Rus are actually Vikings, Danes. For example, they founded Dublin and ruled it for over 400 years, which actually, if you read my Gareth and Gwen Medieval Mysteries, there are Danes in it. They began raiding in England in Lindisfarne in 793 AD, just about the time Offa's Dyke was being finished. This conflict was again between pagan and Christian because the Saxons had converted to Christianity by then. I love the name of this army, the Great Heathen Army of 865. That's actually what the Saxons called them. That's not mine, that's theirs. The Danes also brought their families and settled. Ultimately, England was divided between Saxon and Dane. At long last, all Saxon attention turned east instead of west into Wales. This provided breathing room for the first time in centuries for the Welsh. It was really an age of Welsh independence, Renaissance, if you will, not a dark age for them, because remember, they're Christian and they're literate. So looking at the map again, the three main kingdoms are Gwynedd, Powys, and Deheubarth. They had their own laws. The Laws of Hywel Dda, codified around 945. These outlined the obligations of kings to their citizens and vice versa. This is not feudalism. There are more rights for women. They can divorce. They have control over their own children. Illegitimate sons could inherit equally with legitimate ones as long as their father acknowledged them. And that becomes relevant for me as an author because over there is The Good Knight, which is the first book in my Gareth and Gwen medieval mystery set in the time of Owain Gwynedd, around 1143. I got an early review on the book that was like, this woman doesn't know anything that she's talking about. There's no way a prince could be illegitimate. He would never inherit. And one of the main characters is the son of the king of Gwynedd, and he is in fact illegitimate. He is in fact a prince. He is in fact eligible to inherit. That's another example of me having, obviously I didn't do a good job in this case because I got a review that said I was completely wrong, but we have to educate about that this is not what you're used to. If you have not ever read a book set in medieval Wales, this is not England. And most people just, they see medieval and they think one thing, and this is another thing. The Welsh were herders, not farmers, another contrast with the Saxons. They had relatively small populations and few towns. At the time of Llywelyn, there was roughly 300,000 Welsh and 3 million English. That proportion, obviously. Now I think there's 3 million English and 60 million. No, it's 3 million Welsh and 60 million English. Their kingdoms were divided into smaller administrative units. Commots are the small ones, cantrevs are the larger text. So this is a cantrev, this is a commot. There were 22 Llysoedd, that's a palace. Llys is a palace in Welsh, in Gwynedd alone. And these are administrative centers, and their layout was codified by law. They had a king's hall, quarters, barracks, a kitchen. You'll notice that this is not a castle. It's just a wall. It's meant to keep out roaming cattle. And the reason it's not a castle is because the Welsh didn't have to protect themselves from their own people. When you have a king who was part of you, you don't need to build, that king does not need to build a castle. These are the rulers of Gwynedd and Deheubarth, beginning with the dynasty of Rhuddlan Mawr, the king of Gwynedd, starting in 844. The brown box indicates kings of Deheubarth, the yellow kings of Gwynedd. Many of these kings obviously ruled both. And these families ruled most of Wales for 450 years. Hywel Dda, up over there under Deheubarth, was a descendant. The most important one, I guess, for our purposes of the talk is here, Llywelyn the Last, or Llywelyn ap Griffith. This is a map showing northern France, and a little bit of England up there at the top. Earlier we talked about the Danish invasions. At the same time the Danes were invading England, they attacked France, sacking Paris in 845. Now, the King of France had the brilliant idea to bribe the Danes with land, which is kind of like what happened in England with the Danelaw thing. The Danes took that deal, taking over Normandy. They actually assimilated enough such that they called themselves Normans, and they spoke French. But their ancestry was Danish. They were still Vikings. And they still love to go a Viking, which they did in 1066 when the Normans, led by William the Conqueror, turned their attention to Britain. They came with overwhelming force. They brought feudalism, Norman culture, and their own brand of Christianity, because of course they assimilated enough to convert to Christianity too. The Norman recipe for conquest, in a nutshell, is invade with an army, build castles, and rule with an iron fist. In this way, the Norman conquest was a lot more like the Roman conquest. They wanted to control resources and land, and they didn't much care what the Saxons did, as long as they didn't fight back. In the same way the Britons never became Roman, the Saxons never became Norman. We speak English, we don't speak French, and that's because the language remained English. The Normans struggled for control. They had an easier time in the south and east, as always, as the Romans had done. Initially, they didn't conquer Scotland nor Wales. But what they did do, and what William's brilliant idea, was to create marcher lordships in the march. And march is like a French word for fence. So Chester, Shrewsbury, and Hereford, his three top guys, and he said, if you can hold on to this land, you can keep it. And they carved out many kingdoms for themselves as a buffer between Wales and England. It's not Offa's Dyke, it's actual kingdoms, essentially protecting England from Wales. What these marcher lords did as well was build castles. And so Wales has the highest number of castles per capita, per square mile in the world. In Europe, I guess. We don't have much in the way of castles in America. In response, finally, the Welsh built their own castles. They were smaller. They were designed more as a refuge to guard passes through the mountains and to protect resources like cattle. The Normans had an easier time in the south and east of Wales, so the march extended all the way to Pembroke and St. David's in the south, and much of those three marcher lordships remained in English control or Norman control. But the north and west actually held off the Normans for close to 200 years. Actually, more than 200 years. So this brings us to Llywelyn. Llywelyn was important because his lifespan and rule encompassed the last 50 years of Welsh independence. Over the course of the 13th century, the Welsh had been forced more and more to engage with the Normans and found their position growing weaker. This brought Llywelyn into increasing conflict with the kings of England, initially Henry III, and then his son, Edward I. The First Welsh War in 1277 resulted in a terrible loss for the Welsh and a nearly complete takeover of the country by the Normans/English. Llywelyn's lands were reduced to those in Gwynedd, west of the Conwy River. His brother Dafydd, who had supported King Edward in this war, was given most of the lands to the east. The story of the last Welsh War begins on Palm Sunday, 1282. Dafydd, finding this deal that he'd made being less desirable as the time went on, attacked Rhuddlan Castle on Palm Sunday and had arranged, amazingly, honestly, for a simultaneous attack on Aberystwyth Castle and Harlech. All three castles were part of King Edward's control of Wales. Llywelyn actually did not join this fight immediately. His brother had tried to assassinate him once. They weren't like great friends. But in June, Llywelyn's wife Eleanor died in childbirth, giving birth to Llywelyn's only child, Gwenllian, a daughter. Then, also in June, there was a huge Welsh victory in the south at Llandelo Fawr in Deheubarth. At that point, Llywelyn realized he had nothing left to lose, and he joins the rebellion and immediately is accorded control of the entire endeavor. Nobody else trusts Dafydd either. So this chart shows a series of these events of 1282 leading up to the conquest of Wales. Most of 1282, as I said, was a series of Welsh victories, and here we have come full circle to the Battle of the Menai Strait that I talked about at the beginning. Once this battle was won, Llywelyn received a letter from his nephews, Edmund and Roger Mortimer, pledging to change allegiance. They are marcher lords, supporters of King Edward, but given the Welsh successes and that it was winter and that the English barons were like, we're losing, why are we wasting all this money on a country that isn't really paying off in the first place? And the king was running out of money. There seemed a reason to believe that this could, in fact, be a credible offer. Regardless, Llywelyn went to meet them. And then Llywelyn ap Griffith left Dafydd, his brother, guarding Gwynedd, and he himself and his host went to gain possession of Powys and Buallt. And he gained possession as far as Llangyntin, and thereupon he sent his men and a steward to receive the homage of the men of Breceniog. And the prince was left with but a few men with him. And then Roger Mortimer and Griffith ap Gwenwynwyn, and within the king's host, came upon them without warning. And then Llywelyn and his foremost men were slain on the day of Damasus the Pope, a fortnight to the day from Christmas Day, and that was a Friday. From the Chronicle of the Kings, in other words, December 11th, 1282. The English cut off Llywelyn's head, washed it in this well, and put it on a pike at the Tower of London for 20 years. I have to say, Dafydd carried on afterwards. He actually was the first man of standing to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, practice for what happened with the Scots, and his head went beside Llywelyn's at the Tower of London. Chroniclers at the time said that if Llywelyn had lived only a few more weeks, all of Wales would have flocked to his banner. The failure of the assassination plot might have been the final nail in the coffin of a war that was not going well for Edward. None of that happened, of course, since Llywelyn died. From the moment of Llywelyn's death, King Edward endeavored to eliminate the Welsh way of life in favor of the Norman English one. He began by building what's called his Iron Ring of Castles. This is a series of castles built around the margins of Gwynedd in particular, which is most of the top of the map. These all could be either resupplied from England or the sea. Caernarfon, Beaumaris, Harlech, and Conwy are now World Heritage Sites. Edward needed these castles at all because, of course, he needed to control a hostile populace. An obvious difference between having a native king and a foreign one. At the Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284, he abrogated Welsh laws and customs. This statute eliminated all Welsh governors, much of the Welsh legal system, boundaries, church leaders, and commerce. It also established the English system of sheriffs. Edward, in addition, brought in planted communities of English settlers to live in the walled towns adjacent to the castles. So it could be a little bit of England in the very heart of Wales. The Welsh were expelled from these lands and not allowed inside the towns after dark. As late as 1336, Welshmen who wanted to live in Criccieth were expelled. There's no walled town in Criccieth anymore, the walls are gone, but at one time it was. The English controlled the resources, trade, commerce. They could tax the Welsh and monitored them. And of course, they spoke only English and French. And all of the officers of the law were English or Norman, in which case the Welsh couldn't even participate in their own society in the language that they spoke. One of the monitor aspects is that for each of these towns, one member of the family, of every family, probably the head of the household, was required to check in at the weekly market in one of these towns. Maybe that's not so onerous, except that the Welsh way of life was hurting, and they would follow, in a sense, a seasonal round from the lowlands to the highlands with the sheep and cattle. They couldn't do that if one member was required to check into the town once a week, because it's a long, this is pre-car, right? And so the English not only took all the land, took the animals, but also prevented the Welsh from actually making a living in the way that they always had. So Edward was ruthless in his attempts to meld a single kingdom out of disparate peoples and wanted to make England and English culture preeminent. Caernarfon became the seat of Edward's administration in Wales. It had been an administrative center for Llywelyn as well as all of the kings of Gwynedd since Roman times. Because the Welsh High Council had said that they would never accept a ruler not born in Wales, Edward brought his 8-month pregnant wife, Eleanor, all the way to Caernarfon so that she could give birth to Edward II in a half-built Caernarfon Castle. I actually have a book about that. Crouch back, it's about that. But later, Edward named this son the Prince of Wales. And ever since then, the Prince of Wales has been the son of the English king. Which brings me to Footsteps in Time. All of this history that I have just given you, a jaunt through medieval Britain, prompted me to write Footsteps in Time back in 2006. And for me, as an author, I was just drawn to this one moment in history when everything changed. The story actually came to me in a dream. I dreamed that I drove my minivan. This is my minivan. It's that blue-green color that I talk about in the book. My minivan, it's a Toyota Previa, into Wales and saved Llywelyn's life. The book ended up not being about me, a middle-aged woman, but a family of time travelers. And Footsteps in Time asks the question, what would have happened had Llywelyn lived, and what happens to the people who save him? And I thought, if you'll bear with me, I could read the prologue from Footsteps in Time for you. I'm going to do it from my phone. Let's see if I can figure this out. Oh, I got it now. Okay. So I don't want to give away the plot. You all know that I saved Llywelyn's life, so we can start with that. But this is the prologue to Footsteps in Time. Llywelyn. How can you leave Gwynedd undefended, my lord? Without you, we can't hold back the English. Conwy stood with his back to me, gazing out the window at the courtyard, where a dozen men prepared to ride out on a scouting mission. I didn't envy them, for rain lashed their faces, and the temperature hovered just above freezing. It was cold for November, even here by the sea. I put aside the letter I was writing and gave Conwy, my steadfast friend through nearly 50 years of governing and fighting, my full attention. Davith will hold the north for me, and you with him, I said. You may travel with me as far as Castell, but not beyond that. I need you to watch Davith and rein him in if necessary. Davith. Conwy swung around to face me. Traitor isn't too strong a word to describe him. You can't deny it. I don't deny it. Davith follows always his own desires, usually in direct opposition to mine. I can't trust him to remain true to Wales or to me, but I can trust him to remain true to himself. For now, his interests and those of Wales coincide. I picked up my pen and twirled it in my hand. It's not Davith's loyalty that concerns me, but the Mortimers. The Mortimers. Conwy's tone for them matched the one he'd used for Davith. We've heard rumors only. They hold Bwlch Castle for King Edward, and no amount of persuasion is ever going to talk them out of it. So Margaret said, you still want to risk it? You listen to neither her nor me. If you go south to meet them, I fear you meet your death. I do listen, Conwy, I said. That's why you're staying behind, in case I don't return. The men will follow Davith if they know you stand with him. Conwy rubbed his face with both hands. There's nothing I can say to persuade you not to make this journey. If we are to defeat the English once and for all, if I am to rule Wales in fact as well as name, I must control the south. The Mortimers' allegiance will straighten my position and shorten the war. Surely you can see that I must meet them. If it were true, I would see it, my lord, but I don't believe they will betray England. Not all men bend with the wind as easily as Davith. Some bend, some break. I picked up the letter and saluted Conwy with it. This time either Edward or I will break. I know only that I can bend no longer. Conwy took a deep breath. May I take my leave, my lord? I nodded. Conwy bowed and left the room. I gripped my pen, reading over the words I'd written, and signed my name at the end. We fight because we are forced to fight, for we and all Wales are oppressed, subjugated, despoiled, reduced to servitude by the royal officers and bailiffs, so that we feel and have so often protested to the king that we are left without any remedy. That actually quote was something that Llywelyn did in fact write in history to King Edward during this time where he was where the Archbishop of Canterbury was attempting negotiation. So as of today, I've written 20 books in the series. I'm working on 21. Having Llywelyn live has allowed me to reimagine a whole series of conflicts and stories. And the series begins with this forging of Welsh independence from England and takes off from there. So Llywelyn lives. And then what happens? And that's really the question that is the central premise of this series. I also want to say, so the first book in the series is Footsteps in Time. Daughter of Time is a prequel to it, taking place 14 years earlier. So people start with Footsteps in Time, some start with Daughter of Time, depending on their preference. If you read an ebook, Daughter of Time is actually free at all retailers. So maybe that's why most people start with Daughter of Time. But, you know, through 20 books, we move actually to Scotland and Ireland and France. As an anthropologist, you know, my idea has always been to convey how interconnected these histories are and how interconnected people are. Back when, you know, earlier in the talk I was talking about how as an anthropologist, for me, history is anthropology of the past. And it's like, how are these people who lived 750 years ago actually like us? In some ways they're not. Their lives were extraordinarily different from ours. And at the same time, maybe a lot the same. And that's, you know, essentially what I try to convey while telling a good story. These books are family friendly, just if you're interested. And I'm always interested in a more uplifting story than a everyone dies at the end. Just saying. Well, that's why Llywelyn survived, right? You know. So throughout all my books, Wales is showcased as its own separate people and culture. And so as you can see here, I have 5 series and matches our little chart that that Dan created. So the Lion of Wales series is set in the 500s. It's about King Arthur, who was Welsh, just in case you didn't know. The Last Pendragon saga has a lot of Welsh mythology elements and its intersection with Christianity. That's set in the 7th century. And then the Gareth and Gwen Medieval Mysteries, I referenced The Good Knight, which is the first book in the story. The Bard's Daughter is just a novella prequel. Set in the time of Owain Gwynedd, which is 1143 AD, during the age of independence of Wales from England. Then, of course, after Cilmeri series, and then this series, which is my newest one, the Welsh Guard Mysteries, which take place in 1284. So as I said, Crouchback is at the half-built Caernarfon Castle when Eleanor gives birth to Edward II, and it's the real history. I often say that my books are as historically accurate as I can make them, except when they're not, with a lot of the not being, you know, here. I'm never one to sort of compress a timeline. If a battle occurs 3 years after an event, I'll write a different book where that battle occurs. I won't. I work very, very hard to make the history incredibly accurate. The fun thing with the After Cilmeri series is that it incorporates this American family, but at the same time, all of the historical characters are historical people. We have Humphrey de Bohun, we have King Edward, we have King Edward's daughters, we have real people interacting with my time travelers. In truth, you know, there's a million stories to tell. I often say that it's like I couldn't make some of this stuff up. Wales, medieval Wales just has events that occur. I mean, so much of what went on with David, Llywelyn's brother, it's like, really? Like, really? Yeah, it's real history. Orson Welles once said, if you want a happy ending, that depends, of course, on where you stop your story. My problem is that I didn't want the story to stop where it did, with the death of the hero. The life and death of Llywelyn ap Griffith was a story that desperately needed someone to retell, and so I did. Thank you.